the TCT Computing Group's webinar, Test Case Development Tips and Tricks. TCT Computing Group is a large HP authorized training partner providing HP tool training. Our consulting division provides tool-specific support as well as test management and TMMI assessments. Our host for the conference today is Pamela Fusco. Pamela holds several HP certifications as well as the internationally recognized certification from ISTQB. She teaches HP classes as well as the ISTQB Foundation Level course. She is a senior consultant who works with several Fortune 500 companies on testing best practices and ensuring their HP tool implementations are successful. Pamela will present for approximately 20 minutes. If you have a question during the webinar, please post the question in the Q&A section. At the conclusion of the webinar, Pamela will respond to questions posted. Pamela?
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to first go over our agenda for the next 20 minutes. That agenda is to give you an overview and some things to think about before we actually go through the individual four-step process. And then we'll go through each of the 4 steps. The first step is to analyze the test basis. Second step is to identify the test conditions. Then we'll specify those test cases, and finally develop test procedures. So as you can see, we have some definition things to go through, as well as what each of those steps constitutes. First thing to think about is the formality of testing. And we recognize that the formality of testing at your individual organization or on an individual project can be very, very different from each other. So even though you may do all of your projects for one company, each project can be a little bit different in its formality. And we bring this up because even though we have a 4-step process, the level of formality with that 4-step process can vary greatly. So we may start out with a very informal process where there is little or no documentation. And perhaps we have a business owner and a developer who sit down to enjoy a cup of coffee and talk about a limited use internal application that needs to be developed. In this case, I would not expect to have very much documentation, if any at all. You may also have an informal process if your application development lifecycle has a limited amount of time. Now, on the other extreme, we have a very formal process. And in this case, we have everything documented, everything from our test basis all the way through to our test summaries that we produce at the very end of our testing process. So we would expect to see full documentation with approval signatures on everything. So where do you actually fall in this process? Very informal or formal? And what's right and what's wrong? Well, the answer to that is it actually depends on a number of things. First, it depends on your individual organization and the project. How much time, how much money do you have? How mature is the test process at your organization? Is there actually a test group that's established? As I mentioned, how much time, how much money? Who is actually involved in testing? Do they know how to test? Do they need training classes? Are we using business users as testers? And finally, are there any regulatory requirements that we have to meet with this application? So there is no right or wrong in the formality of testing as it applies to the application development lifecycle. There is still a process, and that process is to analyze the test basis, and then we prioritize that test basis. We identify the test conditions, and we prioritize those. Then we specify or design the test cases, and we prioritize again. And finally, we develop the test procedures and prioritize the test procedures. So at this point, we're going to go through each one of the 4 steps and talk about what they actually mean. So the first step is to analyze the test basis. So we need to define what a test basis is. A test basis is anything by which you can base your tests. It may be business processes, it might be testing requirements, it could be a user guide, the design specs, or maybe you just sit down and interview the business owners. Point is there's always something that we have to analyze, to think about. And while we're analyzing that test basis, the back of our heads, we need to be constantly thinking, how am I going to test this? How does this flow together? Is there a risk to it? What is that risk? And knowing that some of those things are more important than others. In other words, we're starting on prioritizing. So we analyze that test basis. The bottom of this slide, I have an example of a very simple test basis. And it reads, online orders will be processed on the next working day. Orders will be mailed within 2 days. Payment must be made by standard credit card. If a partial order must be sent, the customer will be notified and can return their order within 30 days for a full refund. So as I read that simple test basis, I have a couple of questions. The first words that I have questions about are working day. So what is a working day? Does that mean we only process online orders Monday through Friday? Or is Saturday a working day? So question that needs to be answered. What does orders will be mailed within 2 days mean? Is that 2 working days, or does that mean non-working days? So do we mail orders out on Saturday or Sunday, for example? Standard credit card. What is that? MasterCard, Visa, or do we take American Express and Discover? If a partial order will be sent, customer will be notified. How? Are we going to send them an email? Are we going to send them a snail mail? Is it simply part of the confirmation that comes up on their screen when they've completed the order? How are we going to notify them? And finally, can return their order within 30 days for a full refund. Well, it's in the same sentence as partial order. So if I order 2 of an item and we have to ship out 1, does that mean that I can return 1 and get a full refund for both items? So as you can see, we do have some questions, but those questions have come up through analyzing that test basis. Once I have started analyzing the test basis, we're also going to start with prioritizing. And there are 3 things that we need to keep in mind when we begin assigning priorities to the test basis. The first thing is business. How important is this particular piece to the business? If this process doesn't work, what are the users going to do? Is there a workaround? Failure. What is this a process that may actually fail when I go to test it? Is it a new platform? What's the anticipated failure rate? And finally, I'm going to take into account complexity. Does it take a lot of screens to get through this process? Does it integrate with other applications? How complex is this particular piece? Please keep in mind that as a tester, prioritization is not supposed to be done only by you. you should be prioritizing the test basis with the business owners. The business owners are the ones that built the test basis, or at least had some input into it. So they understand in great detail the overall importance of the various components within that application. So we've now studied and analyzed the test basis, assigning priorities. And the second piece that we do is to identify test conditions. I love to identify test conditions in brainstorming meetings. Coming up with test conditions is not something that begins and ends on certain dates. It's an ongoing process, especially because once we start testing the application, you're probably going to come up with more test conditions. Don't throw out things that might be low level. We want to do high level and low level conditions. High level conditions are those that are going to be really important to the business, and low level conditions are those business processes or those things that aren't going to be utilized very frequently. So we want a mixture, and we want as many as we can think of. So continuing with our test basis example, I have 3 test conditions on this screen. First one is I want to place an order on a weekday. Then I want to return an order on a weekend. And I want to return a partial order. So test conditions are simply ideas for testing based off of the test basis. Now, once I've identified or started identifying those test conditions, we are going to prioritize those test conditions. We want to make sure that we're continuing on with business processes that are important to the users, because we're keeping in mind that those priorities may change along the way. So once I've started my list of test conditions and I've started prioritizing, we can then move on and begin designing the test cases. So test cases consist of 4 pieces. The precondition, or what needs to be set up before testing starts, the inputs, so any data needs for that test, outputs, what are the expected results, and the post condition, what's the final state. Based on those conditions, we start. I also want to bring up bidirectional traceability and its importance at this point. We need to know what pieces of the test basis we are actually testing with what test case. And we need to know what test case traces to what piece of the test basis. That's bidirectional traceability. Keep in mind that it may take multiple test cases to adequately test a piece of that test basis. So test cases have 4 pieces: precondition, inputs, outputs, and post conditions. And based on those 4 pieces and my identified test conditions from earlier, I have 2 examples of test cases. The one on the left is to place an order on a weekday. My precondition is I need to have the item I'm going to order in stock. My input is to order a pair of shoes. The result is the shoes are in the order, and the post condition is my stock goes down by 1. On the right-hand side, I'm going to place an order on a weekend. My precondition in this case is that the calendar has to define what a weekend is. I'm going to have the input to order on a Saturday, and my result is that that order gets processed on Monday. My post condition after running this test is that the order gets stored in the system until Monday. So both of those test cases have all 4 pieces. Once I have test cases designed, I am then ready to go ahead and prioritize those. We want to make sure that we have things that are most important to the end users. We have tests with the highest anticipated failure rate and the tests that are the most complex, that cover the most complex features first. So those are going to have the highest priority. Once I've prioritized the test cases, I can then begin filling in the details. The details are what we call test procedures. Writing test procedures is the process of filling in the details for each test case, including user actions and the expected results. It also includes combining those test cases into logical processes. So my test cases get expanded so that I not only have the 4 pieces, but I also have each of the tester actions and what the expected result is for that action, as well as combining those test cases into a logical process. For example, if I have a test case to make an online purchase on a weekday, I also have to pay for that order. So my online purchase for a pair of shoes test case and the payment by Visa card test case might be combined. Remember, each of those test cases are going to have individual user actions along with an expected result for that expected result, for that user action. So for example, my online order might include something like logging into the system, placing an order for a pair of shoes, adding a shirt to the order, paying by Visa card, and then completing or confirming my order. So whatever those combinations are needed for execution, that's part of developing your test procedures. Once the test procedures are done, we're then going to go through and reprioritize by business importance, by the high failure rate, and those that are the most complex. In summary, remember that developing and designing test cases is a 4-step process. We analyze the test basis, whatever that basis may be, whatever combination you can get for that test basis. Based off of that, we identify our test conditions, all the ideas for testing that you can come up with. The more, the better. And remember, that's an ongoing process because sometimes after you start testing, you come up with additional test conditions, and that's okay. From those test conditions, we specify my test cases. Those have 4 pieces: my precondition, my input, my result, and my post-condition. I then develop the test procedures. That's filling in the details for the test cases, as well as combining those test cases for execution. Keep in mind, the formality of doing this can vary greatly from project to project at an organization, and even more so from organization to organization. But it's still a process.
That will conclude the recording portion of this webinar.